to talk about the Ken Burns documentary that just came out this week, The American Revolution. Have you been watching it? Now, Ken Burns, of course, a widely acclaimed documentary guy. I mean, I really, really enjoyed his documentary on the Civil War. Westward Expansion was excellent. He did the Vietnam War, which I really enjoyed. There was one more that I'm trying to remember. Oh, baseball. The baseball one was fantastic. And he's done others. I'm skipping a bunch. But he came out with this new one about the American Revolution, and it's fascinating. I mean, because Ken Burns always does a really in-depth work. It's done, how should I say, very respectfully, they're very artistically, and it gives you a lot of granularity on the detail. Now, is there some, let's just say, bias that comes into this? And I think there is, and that's what I wanted to talk about, because I've now watched all of episode 1 and 2, and I'm just getting started with episode 3. And it's fantastic. It really is. But when I'm flipping through my phone on X, you see all these MAGA guys that are on there that are angry about this because they think Ken Burns is a GD liberal and he's making this whole thing woke. And they get really angry every time Ken Burns points out that George Washington had slaves. Why does he have to keep repeating that? Just say it once and let's turn the page. I want to hear about the Battle of Bunker Hill. I want to hear about Lexington and Concord. And, but he keeps bringing up George Washington had slaves on his plantation, on the Chesapeake Bay at Mount Vernon. And Burns does make a reference to that. And makes reference to the fact that George Washington is a slaveholder. He buys and sells slaves on his plantation. He's a participant in that. And that this is a contradiction to what this whole story is about. The whole story is about freedom, liberty. I mean, in episode 2, they worked their way up towards the Declaration of Independence. And I talk about that all the time in this podcast, about our inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they talked about the process that Thomas Jefferson went in crafting some of those words that we see in the preamble of the Declaration, as well as all the charges of King George III. And this is just fantastic. It's all really laid out nicely. But some of the MAGA folks are angry that they keep hearing negative stuff about America. Why do they keep saying George Washington was a slaveholder? Well, because it's the truth. And because Ken Burns, granted, is he a lefty? Probably. But Ken Burns is an artist, because, filmmakers are artists. And he is showing his own perspective on this because, and this is a valid point, there is an ongoing contradiction that goes on throughout the American Revolution, is that it's a freedom for me, but not for thee. It's freedom for the white male that has come to America to pursue their happiness, but it's not freedom for the black slave, nor is it freedom for, the Indians or Native Americans that are finding that their lands are being taken over. And those are all very valid pieces of criticism. But it's just funny how there's this anger because they say you're looking at it using today's moral lens and applying it to what happened in 1776, when those societal rules didn't necessarily exist. And yeah, that's true. Absolutely true. Because that's how people thought back then. I think we're 250 years down the line. I think we've learned a lot. We've grown a lot. And we better understand those core values within the context of what America is today. And that is a contradiction. And I don't think it was overly played out. It's been mentioned multiple times for one reason or another. But every time it was mentioned, it seemed like a reasonable time to bring it up or bring it up again. But by no means was it dampening the overall heroic acts by a lot of our American founders and what they accomplished in breaking away from Britain, who at the time was the world's largest military presence. I mean, it's really an amazing story, and I'm really looking forward to going through the rest of it. But they even make mention of the fact that even during the movie, or it's not the movie, during the documentary, in actual history, a lot of the people of that time recognized the contradiction too. Even the black slaves who were educated, who understood what the American Revolution was about, they saw the contradiction. And I think it's worthy of bringing up. And you know what? We get 250 years down the line and celebrate the 500th anniversary of the United States of America. Cross your fingers. Hopefully it lasts that long. Well, there's going to be new things we're going to learn. There's going to be a different moral lens that's going to be applied to history, and that's okay. But the facts are the facts, and the facts are being shared throughout this documentary. I think it's really good. Now, one other thing I thought was interesting to me, a lot of people like to comment that Ken Burns is really good at making these films in such a way that you learn about things that you never learned about before. And that's true, for sure. And we just get a lot more granularity, because when you're learning American history, when you're in high school, or certainly when you're in the younger grades, but even in high school history, you're just getting a top surface view of it. Many people don't even take history classes in college. I didn't. I mean, I was a math computer science guy, so I didn't have to have a history requirement. But there's a lot of people that only have that glossy sort of brochure version of the American Revolution. That picture of George Washington on the boat going across the Delaware. They're just, in some cases, maybe a distorted view of reality, a propagandized view of reality. Ken Burns sort of brings you all, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And that's what makes it so good. But there is legitimate ugly in this. And I think the ugly needs to be pointed out. And again, from a filmmaker perspective, I get why he's doing it. And I don't find it that big of a problem. But there are new things that we've learned. We've learned, real detail about how Concord and Lexington went down, et cetera, et cetera. But here's the one thing that I learned that I never really thought about. It should have been obvious to me. I don't know why I never thought of it in these terms. Was that the American Revolution wasn't just a battle between the 13 colonies in Britain, or the 13 colonies allied with allied with France against Britain, or the involvement in Canada, yada, yada. The thing about it that really opened my eyes is that it was a civil war. It was another civil war. And I went, oh, yeah, it is, because there were loyalists and there were patriots, and people were picking sides in Boston and in New York and in Philadelphia and small villages and hamlets all over New England. And the ones that were more conservative, more law and order, kind of like they are today, were aligned with the establishment, in this case, the king, the crown. And then there were the patriots that wanted independence, wanted to be free, were more liberal, more progressive, more whatever. That was a different force in America. And so, yeah, it was a civil war. And I went, okay, wow. The other thing I was just also reflecting on is that none of my ancestors were part of the Revolution era. In fact, none of my ancestors came through the Civil War in America either. They didn't immigrate here until the 1880s at the earliest. So it's interesting to follow that history, but I know that my bloodline isn't connected to it, but it's still, I'm an American and it's part of America's history. And I really enjoy the series. Now, remember I was talking about earlier about how the MAGA people were angry about using today's moral lens and looking backwards in time and applying it to 1776. But I was also watching this. I was looking at it, the scope in the other direction. I was applying the lessons and the morals that were themes in 1776, like all men are created equal, like our inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those kinds of ideals How are they doing today in 2025? And you look around and you're saying, oh my God, what has happened to America? When you see ICE rounding up people and, you know, arresting them, tackling them to the ground, handcuffing them and taking them away, those GD illegals. I mean, that people that came to America in 1776 were coming from other parts of the world. And we saw more immigration from a vaster portions of the world later on in American history. Immigration is baked into the DNA of who America is and what it's all about. But yet today, immigrants who didn't follow the rules are being handcuffed and kicked out. Does that ever make you wonder if the rules that exist for immigration are aligned with liberty or even the right to your own life, to pursue your own happiness? That's what these immigrants are doing. Whether they're legal or illegal, they're coming to America to pursue their happiness. And by the way, the Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal with certain inalienable rights, not just white men, not just Christians, not just heritage, multi-generational American families, but everyone. All men, in this context, all humans, are created equal. Not that we have equal money or equal power or equal families or equal health, but that we have equal rights, that we are equal under the law. But do we see that in America? No. We see people that are above the law. I mean, look at this whole circus with the Epstein files as a great example of that, where people are protected from accountability before the law. And don't get me started with President Trump. Now, he wants immunity. He wants to, not be held to account for his crimes, but he wants to hold other people to account. We don't have equality under the law here. We're violating the all men are equal clause in the Declaration of Independence. So it's interesting to see it from that point of view. It's also interesting to see how angry people were with the Boston Tea Party and those taxes, those tariffs. And remember, they also had the Stamp Act, which was this embossed stamp that was put on almost all paper goods, newspapers, a whole variety of things that ended up being a tax. It was almost kind of like some of these all-encompassing tariffs that President Trump is using around the world that jacked up the prices of goods. And it was only by a few percent. I mean, the tax on the tea that caused the Boston Tea Party was a tax on tea, but it was nowhere near the tariff that's being put on coffee in America right now. Yet back then, people were rightfully angry, felt that their liberty was violated, and now we just sort of roll over and accept it. The tariff's no big deal. And by the way, no big deal that the president enacted those tariffs unilaterally, when the Constitution is the thing that says that the Congress shall have the power of the purse. Congress is supposed to be the one that decides if there's going to be tariffs. Of course, in the early 70s, some kind of a law was set up that if it's an emergency, then the president can do it on his own, which essentially ignores the Constitution. And then we find out that President Trump's using all of these tariffs under a declaration of an emergency. We have an emergency, and that's why we had to put tariffs on the price of coffee and on bananas that he's now withdrawing. So it's just odd how we don't get as angry with taxes today as people did back then, particularly unjust taxes. And the level of taxation in America is outrageously high on a percentage basis compared to what it was 250 years ago. Amazing, isn't it? So I'm looking forward to watching more of this show. I think it's going to be great. I've gone back and rewatched other Ken Burns documentaries, and every time I watch it, it's fascinating. It's, they always say, truth is stranger than fiction. Sometimes watching a really good historical piece, whether it's a documentary or maybe it's a little bit of a Hollywood production, although this one isn't. I always find that historical stories sometimes are more interesting, more entertaining, more dynamic than some of the things that are made up in fiction. And plus, we learn a few things as we go through it. So, the War of Independence, or I should say, the American Revolution. Ken Burns. He's got a couple of other names there on the title. I can't completely read it from here, but it's really good, and I'd encourage you to check it out and watch it. Okay.